In this episode, the assassination that wasn't supposed to start a world war, the 6 weeks that proved every diplomat wrong, the cousins who were kings and couldn't stop the machine they had built, and the moment the summer of 1914 became the point of no return. Let's go to Episode 2, The Trigger, Sarajevo and the Summer of 1914.
Empires do not fall in a day. They fall in a sequence of decisions, each one smaller than the last, each one seeming reasonable at the time. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had been managing crises for decades by the summer of 1914. It had survived wars, revolts, the slow unraveling of Ottoman power in the Balkans. It was old, and it was practiced, and it believed, as empires tend to believe, that it knew how to handle difficult moments. The news that arrived from Sarajevo on the afternoon of June the 28th was a difficult moment. Vienna was certain it could handle it. Vienna was wrong. To understand why 2 shots fired by a 19-year-old in Bosnia could drag 8 nations into war, you first have to understand the world those shots landed in, not the political world. We will get to that. The human world. The world that produced GavriloPrincip, and the world that made him believe that what he was about to do was not merely justified, but necessary. Bosnia was Austro-Hungarian territory, a fact that for Princip and thousands like him was not administration, but occupation. And it was that specific feeling, not a political opinion, but a lived daily reality that the movement Princip belonged to had been built upon. Princip belonged to a movement called Young Bosnia, a loose constellation of South Slavic nationalists, most of them teenagers or young men in their early 20s, who believed that the liberation of the South Slavic peoples from Austro-Hungarian rule was the great moral cause of their generation. They were romantics in the truest sense. They believed in the power of a single symbolic act to ignite a revolution. They had been reading Nietzsche and Mazzini and the anarchist literature that circulated in secret across university towns. They were not, for the most part, organized military operatives. They were students who had convinced themselves that history could be redirected by individual courage. Behind Young Bosnia stood a darker organization, the Black Hand, known formally as Union or Death, a secret society with deep roots in the Serbian military. The Black Hand had supplied Princip and his small group of conspirators with the weapons for the attack. Browning pistols and 6 grenades, brought across the Serbian border by sympathetic military contacts. The exact degree to which the Serbian government knew about the plot, and whether it sanctioned or merely tolerated it, was never fully established. What was established was this: the weapons came from Serbian military arsenals, and that, as we will see, was enough. FranzFerdinand, Archduke of Austria-Este, heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, was not a popular man. He was known to be temperamental, difficult, and deeply conservative, a man who believed in the empire his family had built and intended to preserve it. He was also, paradoxically, one of the voices within the Austro-Hungarian establishment who counseled caution regarding Serbia. He understood that a war with Serbia risked bringing in Russia. He understood that war with Russia could unravel everything. He had said so repeatedly to people who had not always been pleased to hear it. On the morning of June the 28th, FranzFerdinand and his wife Sophie, a woman he had married against the wishes of the imperial court, in a relationship that had cost him considerable status and never ceased to be viewed with condescension by Vienna's aristocracy, arrived in Sarajevo for a state visit. The city had been decorated, officials had lined the route, and 7 conspirators had positioned themselves along the Apel Quay, the broad riverside road the motorcade would travel, each carrying weapons, each with a different level of nerve and resolve. The first attempt failed. One of the conspirators threw a grenade at the Archduke's car. It bounced off the folded back roof, rolled under the following vehicle, and exploded, injuring officers in the second car but leaving the Archduke unharmed. FranzFerdinand, by most accounts, remained remarkably composed. He continued to his official appointments. He insisted, afterward, on visiting the officers wounded in the attack at the local hospital. It was on the way to this second destination, on a route that had been changed, then miscommunicated to the driver, then corrected, that the motorcade took an unplanned turn onto Franz Josef Street and stopped almost directly in front of GavriloPrincip. Princip had given up. He had been standing at his assigned position when the grenade exploded, had seen the motorcade speed away, and had concluded the mission was over. He had walked to a nearby delicatessen on Franz Josef Street and was still there when the Archduke's car turned the wrong corner, stalled its engine not 5 feet away from where he stood, and remained stationary long enough for him to step forward and fire twice at almost point-blank range. The first shot struck Sophie in the abdomen. The second struck FranzFerdinand in the jugular vein. Both were dead within the hour. And the world, though it did not yet know it, had just changed for the next 30 years. What happened next is one of the most studied sequences of events in modern history, and one of the most instructive, not because of its complexity, but because of its simplicity. The killing created a crisis. The crisis activated a system, and the system, once activated, had a logic of its own that operated faster than human deliberation could contain. Austria-Hungary's response was not immediate. Vienna spent 3 weeks deliberating. The deliberations were not really about whether to respond. The killing of the heir to the throne was, by the standards of the time, an act that demanded response. The deliberations were about how far to go, and the answer that emerged from those 3 weeks was, as far as necessary to humiliate Serbia so thoroughly that the Serbian nationalist project would be set back a generation. The instrument chosen was the ultimatum. The Austro-Hungarian ultimatum, delivered to Serbia on July 23, 1914, contained demands that Serbia could not accept without surrendering its sovereignty. It gave 48 hours to reply. It required that Austro-Hungarian officials participate directly in Serbia's internal investigation, reaching into the very heart of an independent state. When Serbia replied, accepting the majority of the terms but rejecting the most invasive, Austria-Hungary declared the response insufficient and began mobilizing. Within 72 hours, a regional dispute had become a continental crisis. Here we must pause, because the role of Germany in the weeks following the shooting is, from the vantage point of 2070, one of the most consequential diplomatic decisions of the entire 20th century, and it was made almost casually. On July the 5th and 6th, 1914, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany and his Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg met with the Austro-Hungarian ambassador and gave what history has called the blank check. Germany would support Austria-Hungary in whatever action it chose to take against Serbia, fully and unconditionally. If Russia intervened on Serbia's behalf, Germany would stand by Austria-Hungary. This was not a commitment made under extreme pressure. It was a deliberate, strategic calculation that Russia was not yet ready for war, that France could be defeated quickly in the West before Russia fully mobilized, and that a short, decisive Austro-Serbian conflict could resolve the Serbian nationalist problem once and for all. The blank check was not given by a reckless man who wanted world war. It was given by men who believed they could control the escalation, men who had run the calculations and concluded that a limited conflict was achievable. They were wrong, not because they were stupid, but because the system they were operating was more complex than any calculation could account for. The alliances had created interdependencies so tight that a crisis anywhere in the system triggered responses everywhere. They had built a machine for stability that had quietly become a machine for catastrophe, and they did not discover this until the machine was already running. What is often forgotten about the July crisis of 1914, and what I find, even at this distance, genuinely haunting, is that 3 of the principal monarchs at the center of the escalating conflict were cousins. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, and King George V of the United Kingdom were all grandchildren of Queen Victoria. They knew each other personally, they had corresponded across decades, and in the final days of July 1914, as their governments accelerated towards war, they sent each other telegrams. The telegrams, known to historians as the Willie-Nicky correspondence, are remarkable documents. Wilhelm and Nicholas addressed each other as Dear Willie and Dear Nicky. They expressed personal anguish at the situation. They appealed to each other's reason, to their shared family, to their common interest in avoiding catastrophe. Nicholas wrote that he had given orders for his military not to take provocative actions while negotiations continued. Wilhelm replied that he was doing everything in his power to bring Austria, Hungary, and Russia together. The tone was not hostile, the tone was desperate. And yet, none of it stopped anything, because by the time the telegrams were being exchanged, the military machines had already begun to move. In an age of railway timetables and mobilization schedules, the difference between a partial mobilization and a full mobilization was a matter of hours, not days. Once Russia announced partial mobilization on July the 25th, in response to the Austro-Hungarian ultimatum to Serbia, the German military informed the Kaiser that partial mobilization was tactically equivalent to no mobilization at all. If Russia was going to mobilize, Germany had to mobilize fully and immediately, or lose the initiative. The window for diplomatic maneuver had been, without anyone quite noticing, already closed. The cascade of declarations in the first days of August 1914 is, when you set it out in sequence, almost incomprehensible in its speed. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July the 28th. Russia began full mobilization on July the 30th. Germany declared war on Russia on August the 1st. Germany declared war on France on August the 3rd. Germany invaded neutral Belgium on August the 4th, implementing the Schlieffen Plan, which required the German army to sweep through Belgium to attack France from the north. And Britain, which had a treaty obligation to defend Belgian neutrality, declared war on Germany on August the 4th. In 6 days, 8 nations were at war. 8 nations, and behind each nation, empires. Britain brought in its dominions: Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India. The war that started in a small corner of the Balkans was, within weeks, a genuinely global conflict. Soldiers from the Punjab would fight in Mesopotamia. Troops from Australia would land on the beaches of Gallipoli. Senegalese infantry would serve on the Western Front. The world's first truly global industrial war had begun, and almost nobody, in those August days, believed it would last more than 4 months. The question that historians spent the entire 20th century asking is this: why didn't anyone stop it? The answer, from where I stand in 2070, is not abstract. It has names, it has moments, and each of those moments is, in its own way, more troubling than the general answer. Take the Kaiser. On the night of July the 30th, Wilhelm II received a telegram from his cousin Nicholas, a personal appeal, monarch to monarch, asking him to use his influence with Vienna to slow the escalation. Wilhelm tried. He sent a message to the Austrian High Command urging restraint. The response he received, in effect, was that the military timetables had already been set in motion and could not be reversed without catastrophic loss of operational readiness. The Kaiser, the most powerful man in Germany, had discovered, in the middle of a crisis, that the machine his government had built no longer answered to him. It answered to its own logic. Take the Tsar. Nicholas had ordered a partial mobilization on July the 25th, a careful, limited signal, intended to show resolve without triggering a German response. His own generals informed him, within hours, that partial mobilization was a military fiction. The railway networks, the supply chains, the call-up schedules, none of them had been designed for half measures. The choice, they told him, was full mobilization, or none. Nicholas chose full mobilization, and in Berlin, that decision was read as exactly what the German military had feared: Russia going to war. The sequence became irreversible at that moment, not because anyone had decided to start a world war, because a Tsar had tried to send a careful signal and discovered that the instrument for sending it only had one setting: take Austria-Hungary. The government in Vienna had wanted a limited war, a short, punishing campaign against Serbia that would humiliate Belgrade without drawing in the great powers. They had the German blank check. They had their ultimatum. They believed they had calculated correctly. What they had not calculated was that Russia could not allow Serbia to be crushed without losing all credibility as the protector of the Slavic peoples, and that Russia's mobilization would trigger Germany's, and Germany's would trigger France's, and France's would trigger Britain's. The limited war Vienna wanted was structurally impossible inside the alliance system that existed. But nobody in Vienna had quite understood that until it was too late to matter. By the end of the first week of August 1914, the armies of Europe were moving. On the Western Front, German forces were executing the Schlieffen Plan, the great wheeling advance through Belgium and into France that was supposed to deliver a knockout blow within 6 weeks before Germany had to turn its full attention east. The plan had been wargamed and revised over a decade. It was, on paper, a masterpiece of military logistics, and within weeks, it had failed, not because of poor execution, but because the French and British resistance was stronger than anticipated, because the Belgian defense delayed the German timetable, and because the Russian mobilization in the east was faster than German intelligence had predicted. The failure of the Schlieffen Plan meant that the war would not end by Christmas. Instead of a decisive campaign of maneuver, what emerged on the Western Front was something no one had planned for, no one had wanted, and no one entirely understood how to fight. The trenches. The static, industrial, attritional nightmare that would consume a generation and redefine the meaning of the word war for everyone who survived it. That story, the trenches, the gas, the machine guns, the mud, the silence, belongs to the next chapter. But I want to leave you here at the threshold of August 1914 with a single image. Somewhere in Europe, on the 4th of August 1914, the day Britain declared war and the last of the great powers entered the conflict. There were still people sitting in cafes, reading newspapers, watching the late afternoon light fall on the street. People who had not yet quite understood what had happened, who knew there was a war but could not yet picture what a war of this kind would mean, who still lived, in their bones and in their habits, in the world that had existed the week before, the connected, prosperous, confident world that the previous episode described in detail, and that was now, without most of its inhabitants fully realizing it, already gone. In a few weeks, most of them would understand. In 4 years, all of them would know. What they could not know, what none of them could know, was that this was not the last time. From where I stand in 2070, there are several things about the July crisis that look different than they did to people living through it. The first is the speed. The entire process from a single shot to world war took 37 days. 37 days to activate a system that had taken decades to build and that would take decades and tens of millions of lives to dismantle. The second is the disconnect between intention and outcome. Not one of the leaders who made the key decisions in July 1914 intended to start a world war. They intended to manage a crisis, to send a signal, to protect an interest. The world war was the product of their actions, not their intentions. And yet, the world war happened. Systems built for stability that quietly become engines of catastrophe. Leaders who believe they control events, finding too late that the events control them. Escalation that moves faster than deliberation. I'm not going to tell you that the men of 1914 were uniquely blind to these dynamics. History is more generous than that. I will tell you that these patterns, these exact patterns, did not disappear with the guns of August. They went underground, they waited, and in the decades that followed, they found new forms, new actors, new pretexts. The system that produced the First World War was dismantled. The tendencies that produced it were not.
If this archive is adding value to your understanding of the world, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and click the bell so you never miss a new episode. And if you know someone who would find this story worth hearing, share it with them. Every person who hears this archive is one more person who remembers. The chapter that opened in Sarajevo would run for 4 years. It would consume 10 million soldiers and another 10 million civilians. It would introduce the world to industrialized slaughter, to machine guns that fired 600 rounds a minute, to artillery barrages that lasted days, to poison gas that stripped the lungs from the inside. It would take a generation of young men from across Europe, from Australia and New Zealand and Canada and India, and place them in holes in the ground and ask them to advance across open fields toward those guns. Most of them did it. That, perhaps, is the most astonishing thing of all. The chapter is called Into the Mud. And it begins, as all catastrophes ultimately do, not with a plan for destruction, but with a plan that everyone was quite certain would be over quickly. Don't lose the next episode of Tales from 2070.